I want to start, Mary, if you could just talk to us a little bit about George Washington's early history with slavery, his childhood, and when he became a slave owner. What do we know about this?
George Washington grew up in a family that owned slaves, and so they were part of his life from the time he was born until the day he died. He became a slave owner, which is one of the reasons he said in a statement about slave owning that it was the only unavoidable subject of regret about his life. And the reason he's saying that is because he became a slave owner when his father died when Washington was 11 years old, and he inherited 10 slaves at that point. So he had no say in the matter. He was an 11-year-old kid. And so from then on, he's a slave owner. But he kind of changes his mind about that
Over time.
Over time.
Let's talk about the context in which all this happened. So, Virginia. We don't have to go all the way back to 1619, but we can. Talk to us a little bit about the context of slavery in colonial Virginia around the time of Washington's childhood in the 1730s and 40s. What's your sense of the broad picture of slavery in this colony?
Slavery is growing rapidly in Virginia in the 1730s. And he's growing up in Westmoreland County, which is south of here on the northern neck. At that point, Virginia is desperately seeking workers. And they are the largest percentage or number of convicts are being brought in from Britain during Washington's childhood to Westmoreland County to work as indentured servants. And at this point, there's just a huge influx of Africans who are enslaved. And so they're coming directly from Africa from about the time of Washington's childhood until roughly the time he gets married.
So in this world where it's everywhere in Washington sight, let's look a little bit into the question of opposition to slavery. Is there a sense that slavery may be wrong, that maybe Virginia should go down a different path? How are people talking about slavery and the potential kind of moral quandary of it in the 1730s, 40s, 50s?
Pretty much nobody in Virginia is questioning slavery in that time period. Up until the time of the Revolution in the English-speaking world, almost nobody's questioning slavery, except a few strange people, and they are considered real outliers, like the Quakers.
What do the Quakers have to say? What is wrong with slavery from their perspective?
I think that it's wrong to have.
It's a moral.
It's a moral issue, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like war, and
right.
They're opposite pretty much everybody else in Virginia at the time.
But in 1759, Washington becomes much more deeply involved in the institution of slavery for reasons that are pretty obvious. But talk to us about that. What happens when he marries Martha Dandridge Custis?
So Washington married Martha Custis on January 6, 1759. At the time, they were she was like 28 years old. He was coming up on 27. There's about a 9-month difference in their ages. You often hear, Washington married a rich widow and with children, and you think that she's much older. She's like 9 months older. Right. The problem that they had was that Martha's first husband died without leaving a will, which meant that according to both British common law and Virginia law, Martha, as the widow, got a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's property, including the slaves. So that brought her about 80-something slaves. George Washington, because she was now married to anybody, George Washington had control of the slaves, the land, a certain amount, the money. on Martha's behalf and also on behalf of the children. But he doesn't really own that property.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't own that property. That property belongs to the Custis estate.
And you said she doesn't really own the property.
She has a lifetime use of it.
At this point, I know that a lot of us, because we spend a lot of time here in Mount Vernon, know something about the 5 farms. But are there multiple farms in Washington and Martha's world at this point? And how many plantations are they thinking about, and how do they manage that?
Daniel owned at least 5 plantations in down near Williamsburg in Westmoreland County. He was he came from one of the wealthiest families in Virginia and was the only surviving child in that family. So when his father died in 1749, he inherited quite a bit of property. And so it was something like 17,500 acres of land, plus a lot of money, and 280 something slaves.
So talk to us about the logistics of that. How does one person manage multiple states across multiple counties, and we're also talking about a number of workers at each location. What is the day-to-day of someone like Washington or anyone in that role managing multiple estates and multiple locations?
He's too far away to see everything.
So how does he manage it?
So he hires managers. He hires people to manage each of those estates and or each of those plantations. And sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. A lot of times he's not happy with them.
How did Washington, in his own right, how did he particularly manage it? Were there particular quirks that Washington had as he was managing multiple estates and dealing with multiple managers?
If he was nearby, so here at Mount Vernon, he was definitely going out to each of the farms every day, just to make sure that things were being done the way he wanted them to be done. When he was away during the war, during the presidency, he required a letter every week from his farm manager and would also write back to them every week with new instructions or questions about the information that he was being given.
Do most of these survive? Were we able to read these letters?
It depends. George Washington's third cousin, Lund Washington, managed the estate during the American Revolution and for a long time before. So he knew Washington, the stuff Washington expected and that kind of thing. Anyway, I think after his death, he had his widow burn his correspondence with George Washington. So we have a lot of it, I guess, from Washington's copies, but there's a lot we're missing too.
So one of the things that shows Washington's involvement in slavery from an early, not in his boyhood, but later in life, that is particularly difficult for me to wrap my head around is the actual purchase of enslaved people, as opposed to simply inheriting or being given or sort of receiving through marriage. Going out and purchasing feels like a different kind of animal. What do we know about Washington's purchase of enslaved people? Who he may be purchasing, where he's doing it? What do we know?
He's purchasing a lot of people before the Revolution, and between his marriage and the time of his marriage and the Revolution. And he's often buying people at what you might consider an estate sale. So he's going from, he might hear that someone's died and they're selling the slaves, and so he would go to the place, and if there were people there whose skills he could use, he would go ahead and buy them.
He would target particular skills and trades. Okay. And is he? Are all of these people that he's purchasing coming from a lifetime in Virginia, or do we know if he's purchasing any people directly from overseas?
We don't know in the case of the people that he's buying at estate sales about what their stories were. But we do know that he bought slaves directly from at least 2 ships that were coming directly from Africa.
Do we get any sense at this point, I guess we're in the 1760s, kind of as we're kind of moving forward chronologically. Do we get any sense of Washington beginning to exhibit some moral concerns about slavery? Or when do we start to see George Washington maybe having second thoughts about morality of slavery? Is it happening yet?
Not yet. So as we get closer to the Revolution, well, he's been friends with his neighbor George Mason from Gunston Hall, and Mason in the 1760s is talking about what a horrible thing slavery is.
Mason, who
George
also
Mason.
owns many slaves.
Right, and never frees any of his. But he's definitely anti-slavery, and that may be the first time Washington has ever really heard anybody say anything against the institution.
Is there any way for us to know how that shaped Washington?
Maybe. So about 1774, as we're heading into up to the time of the Revolution, Washington is head of a committee here in Fairfax County, and they draw up a list of, it's called the Fairfax County Resolves, and it's things they would like to see changed as far as their relationship with Britain.
Sure.
And one of the things that he puts down there is that they would like to see the slave trade stopped and just totally done away with. And of course that doesn't happen, but
well,
that's the first thing he has to say about it. And it isn't necessarily a statement against slavery. It's a statement against a cruel
and barbarous
traffic.
Yeah. But let's talk a bit about the war years. When he becomes commander-in-chief, so this is, we'll just pick a moment in time, 1775, what is the scale of Washington's slave ownership at this point? Do we know how many enslaved people were at Mount Vernon or at surrounding farms?
So about 1774, Washington draws up a tithables list, as he has to do every year. So he's paying a tax on every worker on his plantation, as well as any hired and indentured white people and the male members of the family. White women weren't considered workers, so they don't have to pay, or you don't have to pay taxes on them. So I believe there were 15 hired or indentured white men or women, because if white women were hired, you would pay a tax on them. So there were 15 white workers at Mount Vernon in 1774 and 104 enslaved
104
men and women. The tithables list don't keep track of anybody under the age of 16 at that point. So there are an unknown number of children, but probably a fair number.
So this gets us to the Revolution, and I think it's pretty clear from my reading of your book, which has a lot of description, not just of Washington and slavery, but also the lives of the enslaved community. I want to move there very quickly, but for Washington and his evolution on the institution of slavery and his thoughts about it, the Revolution seems to be pretty key. So how does the Revolution change things for how Washington views the world? And then I want to talk a little bit about how the Revolution might change things for the lives of the enslaved community. But how did the Revolution begin to change things for Washington's view of things?
Well, the revolution for Washington starts in 1775 when he's made commander of the Continental Army. He goes off to the war, and again, other than saying he thinks we should stop the slave trade, he's not said anything against the institution of slavery. Within 3 years of the start of the war, though, so by 1778, he's writing to his cousin Lund here at Mount Vernon and saying that he doesn't want to be a slave owner anymore. And so then he's trying to figure out what he can do about it. And he's sort of thinking out loud in this letter to Lund that he can't free them. At this point, no one in Virginia, no nobody can free their slaves without a petition to the House of Burgesses, and then the Virginia legislature would decide whether that person could manumit a particular slave. Mm-hmm. And usually it was for some heroic action or something like that, saving a life or something of that nature. So the only options left to him are selling them. Mm-hmm. Well, that's basically the option, is to sell them. And then he's wondering, well, he really doesn't want to split up families. Selling people is too much like selling animals. And he just finds that not very pleasant.
What do we know about Washington's efforts to keep families together? There's a question that asked, did he attempt to keep families together when he made purchases, but also elsewhere in his engagement with the institution?
Before the war, we can't really say.
Okay.
But after the war, there are instances where he's bringing people or contemplating bringing people to Mount Vernon. And in one case, he's looking for a bricklayer, I think, and he's got a person in mind, and he's trying to convince the person to come to Mount Vernon. And he finds out that the man has a wife living somewhere near where he had come from before, and the fellow would really rather stay where he had been because he wants to be near his wife. And so Washington tells his owner that he will bring him up for a while, kind of see how he likes him and how the fellow likes being at Mount Vernon. Mm-hmm. But if he doesn't like it and it can't be reconciled to just seeing his wife going home to see her every once in a while, that Washington says he will send him back and pay rent for the time that he was at Mount Vernon.
So there's certainly some consciousness of the need to keep families
together.
What do we know about the effects of the war on their quality of life, the sort of lives that they were able to lead during the war years?
The enslaved people, as well as pretty much everybody living in Virginia, had a number of hardships to live through, but they're kind of what always happens in a war. So there are shortages of material goods of various kinds. They can't get sugar. They can't get salt, and they need salt to preserve food. So then there are all kinds of workarounds trying to preserve food with a lesser amount of, a not optimal amount of salt. Okay. So they're trying to preserve things in brine and stuff like that, which uses a smaller amount of salt. It's hard to get clothing and textiles that they used to get for the slaves from England. And so it's hard to find those things. And they're ramping up production at home to try to make up for that. There aren't markets anymore. They've lost their European markets. And so they're trying to think of other ways to get money.
So let me ask an obvious question. With all the rhetoric of liberty and the revolution, mm-hmm. how was that shaping things for the enslaved community? You're clearly hearing some of this and hearing mm-hmm. calls for the rights and what we now call human rights, the rights of all of us to be free and to have our own control over our own future. How is this affecting slavery in Virginia or at Mount Vernon?
Well, the slaves are hearing the same things that the white Virginians are hearing and reading about democracy and freedom, yeah. and liberty, and having God-given rights. And they think that makes a lot of sense.
So what happens? Is there a way to see any consequences to this? Or
so you see some of them running away, and there's they had run away before, but they're running away sometimes in larger groups.
Are they running to the British?
Yes, because the British gave them a really good incentive. Early in the war, Lord Dunmore, who was the Virginia governor, offered freedom to anybody who would come over to the British side, to any of the slaves who would come over, which made the white Virginians pretty angry with him. But a lot of people took him up on that.
And people from here at Mount Vernon.
Some people from here.
One of the things that I has always struck me is the famous resignation of his commission in 1783 is succeeded very closely by his coming back to Mount Vernon. He hurries back and is able to be here just shortly thereafter. So we're now in December of '83. What does Washington see when he gets to Mount Vernon? What is the state of things because of the consequences of the war, things like runaways and deprivation? What does Washington find when he comes back?
He finds a less than optimal situation. He's just, I think, appalled when he gets back, and he finds a lot of the buildings are falling apart and haven't been maintained. His cousin Lund, who was managing Mount Vernon, hadn't been paid a salary in 5 years. His taxes haven't been paid, so he owes a huge amount of taxes. No one, Lund should have been going out and collecting rents from Washington's tenants. He hasn't done that. So there's no income from that. Washington, of course, was with the Army for 8 years and hadn't taken a salary for all that time. So he's in a really bad fix financially.
And so we know that Washington stays at Mount Vernon through that time, up through another several years. I don't want to give away the story of Washington's life because clearly none of us know it. But he has other things in store. But in the 1780s, when he's spending time here at Mount Vernon and putting things back together, I wonder if you could talk to us about the breadth and the variety of occupations. It's not simply enslaved people working in a field harvesting crops. There's clearly much more going on, but you know more about this than I do. So talk to us about the kinds of things that are happening among enslaved laborers here in Mount Vernon.
The slaves are involved in a lot of different trades. They're involved with Washington's major change in agriculture. In the late 1760s, for example, he switched from growing tobacco as the main cash crop to sort of mixed grains and as the main staple.
We're talking about wheat and rye and things like that. Okay.
Corn, barley, that kind of stuff. By the 1780s, he's writing to agricultural specialists in England, and he's decided that he wants to take advantage of and learn more about the new scientific agriculture that's being done in England. So he's writing to these people, he's reading books about agriculture, and he's trying to make those changes on his farms here. So the slaves are having to learn new methods of doing things. There's more of an emphasis on using animals and plowing and that kind of. So they're having to learn how to handle ox teams. About a quarter of the workers are considered artisans and craftsmen, or domestic workers.
So what kind of things are artisan and craftsmen doing?
They're carpenter joiners. They make barrels of different kinds. They are blacksmiths, bricklayers, masons, all kinds of different crafts going on. And he often brings in hired and indentured workers in the 1780s to manage the slaves on the individual farms, and he's often looking for people with specialties in either crafts or agriculture. At one point hires supposedly an expert English farmer to help teach some of these new techniques and stuff. And the man gets here and he's afraid of slaves. He's afraid they're going to poison him, and he doesn't last long.
We're close to the war, so Paul actually has a question that I'm curious about because we didn't talk much about Martha during the war years. But he asked, what, if anything, did Martha do about slavery here at Mount Vernon during and after the war? What's her, you mentioned Lund. Is Martha also playing an active role in superintending things here during the war years? What do we know about that?
She was probably working a lot with the women who were doing spinning and sewing and making clothing for everybody else. She's only here about half the time. The rest of the time she's with George Washington in camp. And so I added up all the months, and she really is. It's about half the time of the war she's with George Washington. One of the things that she may have been involved with was the taking care of the slaves and the hired people. Washington orders during the war that they all be inoculated with smallpox or with smallpox so that they don't actually get the full disease. And so she and Lund and Dr. Craig's away at the war, but they're looking after the people as they recover from smallpox inoculation, which gives you a light case of the disease and a much lighter case than you would have gotten if you got it naturally.
Sure. Again, moving just past the war in the 1780s, we'll focus on maybe for a minute. I have a question here that's a good one. How much did Washington himself interest himself in slave productivity, coercion, punishment? What do we know about Washington's direct involvement in some of those little more distasteful aspects of slavery?
He's very interested in productivity. He's interested in all of those
How do we
things.
know this?
So when he's away during the presidency, so this gets us a little later, but he still requires weekly reports or weekly letters from his farm manager, which the farm manager was supposed to draw up every week based on his conversations with the overseers. And he also expected to get a weekly report of all the work done on the plantation. And the way he would do this is look at each farm, and it would tell you that this is the work of X number of people for 6 days a week. So the working week was Monday through Saturday. So if you had 4 people working 6 days, it would be 24.
Sounds right.
So, although we're talking bigger numbers here, but I wasn't a math major. So the overseer for each farm would have to account for 24 days of work by the people working on that farm for that week. And so you find out that Tom is plowing 3 days. He's doing something else, for the other days. Somebody else is doing this, that, or the other thing. And it all has to add up to 24 days worth of work. And if somebody was sick, that gets noted in the report, which they often tell you why they're sick, what happened to them. If one of the women is having a baby, that's marked down, and you can follow over the next few weeks, how much time she has off to recover from childbirth before she has to go back to work.
So Washington's clearly intimately involved in the details.
Oh, very.
What about punishment? Do we know anything about Washington's direct involvement in those kinds of questions?
His longtime secretary, Tobias Lear, comes to work at Mount Vernon in the 1780s. And not long after writes a note to a friend of his back in New England. And Lear grew up in New Hampshire, which is a place where slavery did exist, but it wasn't to the extent that it was practiced here in Virginia. And one of the things he mentions is that Washington had forbidden the slaves at Mount Vernon to be whipped, unless the case was looked into and the word he uses is the defendant found guilty of some bad deed. So I think he's very involved in checking things like that.
We've talked a lot about, and I think we even briefly mentioned children and the lack of the ability to know exactly how many there were young enslaved children here in Mount Vernon. What do we know about life for that age group? I don't know what age of people started working among the enslaved community, but for the younger than that, what were their lives like? At what point did they start being put to work at certain tasks?
So children would go into a group called Working Boys and Girls when they were somewhere between 11 and 14 years old. And I think the reason there's an age range is because kids mature at different rates, and not everybody's going to be ready to work at 11. Before that time, they have very little that they have to do for George Washington.
So what are their lives like?
They're playing. They're getting into trouble. They're swinging on Washington shrubs up near the house, which he doesn't like. So he doesn't want any of them up near there, but it continues to be a problem.
And who's looking after them?
On some of the farms, there's a person, sometimes an elderly person, who seems to be looking after the children. But at other times, it looks like they're looking after themselves. And with, all the things that can happen when little kids are looking after themselves. The other thing I think is going on is, both of their parents are working. And so there are things they're going to need to do around the house to help out, perhaps doing some work in their family garden plots, feeding chickens, drawing water and wood for the cabins. They may have even been able to, do a little bit of cooking or something. So things for their families as well as, and looking after their younger brothers and sisters.
Sure. Tell us about the records. What kind of records are you drawing from to put together this book?
Letters from the Washingtons, various members of the family, letters and journals from the Washington's journals, but also journals kept by people who are visiting Mount Vernon are really important. And often some of the best are from people from Europe who are here and kind of learning about slavery for the first time and seeing it for the first time. Those weekly reports that Washington had drawn up for him are really important, as are the correspondence between Washington and various managers.
Would you say it's a remarkably, comparatively to other places, this is really well documented?
Yes, we have a sort of friendly rivalry with Monticello
Yes,
about who has
we actually do
the fullest records, and we think we do, and they think they do. Okay, but it's a real blessing because there are historic sites all over the country who would kill to have half the documentation we have, and in another way, it's kind of the downside is that you have to go through all of that stuff, and so it takes a long time.
One of the enslaved people that I think many of us recognize by name, and many of us I think used to think we could recognize by an image, was the enslaved chef here at Mount Vernon named Hercules. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that painting that is now we no longer believe is actually a representation of him, and I think many of us can picture it. It's been hanging here in the Lives Bound Together exhibit in the past. But we'll just use him also as a case study to understand enslaved people's lives here at Mount Vernon. Talk to us about Hercules. Who was he? Where did he come? Where did he come from? Where did he go? And what do we know about him?
Well, Washington purchased Hercules in the, I believe, late 1760s. He was a teenager. He purchased him and another fellow, I think, from a neighbor named John Posey who ran a ferry. And Hercules was a ferryman when Washington bought him. Within just a few years, he's moved into the house, working in the house. And by the 1780s, he's one of the cooks at Mount Vernon. About 1777, it seems like he married one of the women here named Alice, and she's usually known as Lame Alice because she was disabled in some way. She was a seamstress, and they had 3 children together, a boy named Richmond and 2 daughters, Evie, who is described in later records as a dwarf, and her sister Evie, and there's a second daughter anyway. Speak up if anybody knows remembers what her name is. Delia. And so they've got 3 children, and Lame Alice dies in 1787. And one of the records, it's for the storehouse account. It's an account book that's kept for what's coming in and out of the storehouse up near the mansion, so sort of across from the kitchen. And more specifically in the rum account, part of that. And when Lame Alice died, Hercules was given 3 bottles of rum, as a way of mourning for his wife. So there probably was some sort of wake or ceremony attached to the burial, and then the rum would be used for whatever. I grew up in a minister's family, so it was known as the party after the funeral. But another idea, Lenny Sorensen from Monticello suggested that the rum also might have been given, if there wasn't sort of a party or wake or something, it may have been given to some other members of the community for helping to prepare the body for burial.
Ultimately, Hercules, is he one of the enslaved people that comes to the president's house?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question about this, and it's a very simple one. Did George Washington own slaves in the president's house when he becomes president, and begins in New York, and then, of course, spends most of his presidency in Philadelphia? Talk to us about slavery during the presidency.
So Washington brings, I believe it's 9 people, enslaved people to the house, the Philadelphia house, and a similar number initially in New York. He's got Hercules in Philadelphia to cook for the family, and there's Ona Judge, who's Martha Washington's maid. There's Moll, who helps to look after Martha's grandchildren there. Giles and Paris, who are employed on and around the carriage. Maybe another waiter. There's, like I said, there's about 9 people. And they work in the presidential household along with a large number of hired and some indentured people as well.
So, and one of the people you mentioned, Ona Judge, has become, I think, even more well-known in recent years. I wanted to tell us her story. I have a question here from James Dandridge, who asks, how did Martha Washington's runaway personal slave, Ona Judge, affect George Washington when Martha insisted that he recover her as the president? But tell us the general story, and then talk about how it may have been something that was a particular challenge for George Washington as president.
Ona began working for Martha Washington when she was about 10 years old. She was trained as a seamstress by Martha, and probably also by her mother, Betty, who was also a seamstress. She was in Philadelphia with her brother Austin, who waited on the table and did a lot of things. He would carry messages back and forth if Washington had messages to go someplace. Austin left his family at Mount Vernon, or because he couldn't take them up to the presidential household. One of the things the Washingtons ran into in Pennsylvania was a law that said that if enslaved people were brought in to the state after 6 months of uninterrupted residency, they could sue for to win their freedom. And the Washingtons didn't seem to have been aware of this. George Washington left Philadelphia in, I think, April maybe of 1791 to go on his southern tour. And right after he leaves, the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, comes to their house and says, there's a problem. He's from Virginia as well and is also a slave owner. He's found out that the hard way that several of his slaves had taken advantage of that Pennsylvania law and were going free. And he felt that the Washingtons were probably going to be facing a similar problem. And so George Washington isn't there. Tobias Lear and Martha Washington work together to try to come up with a plan. They let George Washington know what it is, and he agrees. And so what they do is make sure that nobody's there longer than 6 months before they get rotated back to Mount Vernon under the guise of the family's coming back to Mount Vernon for a vacation, so we need Hercules, let's say, to cook, or I promised Austin's wife that he could come home every once in a while and see her and wouldn't be just stuck in Philadelphia. And so Austin gets sent back to Mount Vernon. And that happens with everybody. And in April, right after the Washingtons first learn about this, Martha Washington goes and pays a visit to a friend in New Jersey, I think it was. And so just that 1 or 2 day trip was enough to stop anybody from being able to, who went with her, they couldn't claim their freedom until another 6 months had gone by.
So at what point is there a runaway moment?
Ona runs away in May of 1796. So she's not suing for her freedom. She's running. She's taking it. And I think there are several reasons, I think, why she ran when she did. Her brother Austin had died at the end of, I think it was 1794, on a trip home to Mount Vernon at Christmas time. Her mother had died in 1795. So two of the things that were sort of keeping her there, were two reasons to stay, were gone.
And how did the Washingtons react?
Not well. But the third reason that Ona ran when she did was there was a talk in the family that Martha Washington would be giving Ona to her oldest granddaughter, and when she died, and Eliza lived in the federal city, so Washington. She lived in Washington D.C., so that meant that Ona would have to. She'd be back in the South, basically, and it's much harder to run away from D.C. than it would be from Philadelphia, and so she had an opportunity and left.
The question on the card asked a little bit about what this can tell us about George Washington and Martha's engagement with slavery. Do they ultimately let her go in peace and wash their hands of it, or how does it play out over the next few years?
The family is trying to get her back, especially in the first year after she's gone. They find out pretty quickly where she is. The friend of the family is the daughter of the governor of New Hampshire, and when her father was senator, they got to know Martha Washington and Nellie Custis and Ona through visits back and forth between the families in Philadelphia, and So this young woman knew Oni when she saw her walking on the street in New Hampshire. And so they knew exactly where she was. The Washingtons knew exactly where she was. And so they start negotiating with her through various officials in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and trying to get her to come back without causing a scene, which would be very embarrassing to Washington. And she says at one point that she's willing to come back if she can be promised her freedom. And George Washington writes back and says, I cannot do that. It's not fair to everybody else who has been faithful for all this time and did not run away. So it's not fair to them and would cause a lot of bad feelings.
So at this point, has Washington already committed himself to freeing all the enslaved people that he can?
He's been working on it.
Is there a point at which you can safely say George Washington is an anti-slavery slaveholder, but someone who is fully committed to the idea that slavery is something that the nation should do without? Is there a point in time where you can feel like you can safely say that?
I don't know that I can specifically say one time, but after the war, definitely by 1778, he himself doesn't want to be a slaveholder.
And more broadly, the idea that slavery is wrong and that the nation should move in a different direction, does that come somewhat later?
A little bit, I think. Tobias Lear, when he writes to his friend in New Hampshire and talks about the defendant being found guilty of some bad deed, he also says that I know that he's thinking about about freeing his slaves. Said otherwise I would have a really hard time working for him. By the time Edmund Randolph comes and tells Martha and Tobias Lear about the Pennsylvania law and the ramifications for the slaves in the presidential mansion. And they come up with this plan to move people in and out of the area. Lear writes to Washington and says, I would not go along with something like this if I didn't know that you were planning on freeing them. So that early, they're definitely, he and Lear have obviously been talking about this stuff.
One of the things that helps to mark time when we think about George Washington are those moments of retirement where he returns to Mount Vernon. So another one comes in 1797, and he has again stepped down from power voluntarily. What does he see when he comes back home this time?
They're not as bad as they were after the war. There's still a lot of work that has to be done on the buildings because upkeep on them wasn't when he wasn't around, it just wasn't happening as regularly as it should have been.
And of course, hindsight allows us to say that we know that there are only a couple of more years left in Washington's time here at Mount Vernon. How do you describe those years? First of all, how massive is the institution of slavery under Washington at this point? How many people are we talking about? And what can you say about that brief era in the late 1790s?
He's still hoping to be able to free everybody. The problem, of course, is
how many people are we talking about?
So we're talking over 300 people by 1799. 41 who were rented from neighbors, 213 who are, 123 who are belong to him, and 153 from the Custis estate.
Okay. So,
large number of people.
And you said he's looking into ways to consider or to find a way to
move
them towards freedom. What are possible plans?
He's looking at selling some of his western lands in order to get the money so that he can reimburse the Custis estate for the value of the Custis slaves, if he can get them to go along with freeing the people.
And at this point, I learned from your book that the Custis slaves and the Washington slaves, they're hugely interrelated and intermarried at this point. So
Right.
it's the idea of them being two separate groups of people is fairly artificial.
Yes and no, because it's still a very real
Under law.
issue. And so one of the things he's worried about is he doesn't want to break up families.
So was he ever able to resolve that question of the Custis heirs' claims on these 100 and some odd?
No, he isn't. He had no luck selling his western lands. And when Julian Niemcewicz, a Polish visitor, is at Mount Vernon in 1798, he mentions that Washington has just sold a huge amount of his western lands, and this is going to bring in something like $183,000, and it looks like he's going to have the money to try to get the slaves from the Custis heirs, and then the guy never, the person he signed the contract with never pays anything, and so it isn't resolved until the 1830s. But there was never any income from that, and so he's just left with what he can do, which is free the people who belong to him, and hope things work out for the best.
And of course, he does this in the will of 1799, which he writes in the summer, and then he though he doesn't know it, he's going to pass away a few months later. What does that will do for those for whom he can free?
What Washington does is the first thing he does is gives Martha Washington the use and ownership of the overall estate for the remainder of her life, so that she doesn't have to worry about finding a new place to live, and it's hers. That's the first provision. The second provision is that upon Martha Washington's death, all the slaves who belonged to George Washington are to be freed. The only exception is his personal valet for many years, William Lee, who is freed immediately upon George Washington's death. The others have to wait till Martha dies. And she ends up, so Washington dies on the 14th of December. His will becomes common knowledge almost immediately. By March, when a young man who waits on the table and stuff in the house, a young fellow named Marcus, runs away, and in the advertisements for him in the paper, they give a description of him and what his clothes are like and all that sort of thing, and they say he's probably going to say that he's one of the slaves being freed by George Washington's will. They said he isn't. He's one of the dower slaves, and Martha Washington is intending to free, it says Mrs. Washington is going to free the Washington slaves early, that she's freeing them in January of 1801. And it turns out to be about a year and a half before she dies. She was advised by several of the executors of the will, like her grandson, Bushrod Washington, who's George Washington's nephew, who inherits the house after Martha Washington dies, and I believe John Marshall, who's a friend of the family, all recommended that she free the Washington slaves early, so that in case someone decided that they wanted to hurry her death along, to get their freedom earlier. And she's worried about that. And so, between December and March, she had just made the decision that she was freeing the Washington slaves on January 1st.
You did mention William Lee, and I want to ask this question from Scott, who asked to talk about the relationship between George Washington and the enslaved people who were with them the longest, who had a close particular relationship with the family. Are there some families or particular enslaved people for whom we know that there was a particular close relationship, and how were their lives different from the other enslaved people in Mount Vernon?
Well, William Lee is with George Washington from the late 1760s. Washington buys him from the widow of a member of the Lee family. And he almost immediately becomes Washington's valet and like constant companion. That if Washington's out going around on horseback, Billy's often with him. And during the Revolution, William is with him for all 8 years of the war, and Washington never forgets that and his loyalty, because he's carrying messages from Washington to other people. He's there when the officers are eating dinner together in the headquarters. He's around all the time. He knows everything that's going on in that camp because he's with George Washington, but he's also with around the soldiers and stuff like that. He would if he would desert to the British, it would be a huge coup, and the information he would bring would be pretty important. Mm-hmm. And Washington knew that, and he knew how loyal Billy was and really appreciated it. So from then on, it was like Billy could do no wrong. So, and Washington would always try to, if Billy wanted something, Washington would try to get it for him. So after the war, during the war, Billy married a woman named Margaret Thomas, who shows up in the Washington war records as Margaret Thomas, but also as Peggy Lee after she marries Billy. And after the war, Billy asks if Washington would bring her to Mount Vernon so they could live together, because she lived up in Pennsylvania. And she was a free black woman. And Washington writes to a friend in Philadelphia and says, you get the idea that he never really liked her very much. He said, I never hope to see her again, but because Billy's asked to bring her here, please make arrangements and see if that can happen. And we have no record that she ever came down here, so it may be that she was too sick to travel and come down here. It may be that she died, or it could be that she just did not want to move to a plantation in Virginia.
Don Woodruff wants to know how we would evaluate Washington as a slaveholder as far as his treatment of those he owned compared to others.
In some ways, he's very much like everybody else. One of the things the visitors always want to know is, was Washington a good slaveholder? Or he was good to his slaves, wasn't he? And Dennis Pogue, who used to work here in the archaeology department, always used to say, how would you define a good slave owner? Or what's a good slave owner? Or there's no such thing as. The people who've actually been enslaved, I'm thinking of Solomon Northup now from 12 Years a Slave. In his memoirs, he said that there were definitely differences between them, and there are good ones and bad ones.
And on that spectrum, where do you put Washington?
A lot would depend on who you were talking to, I think, because there were probably some slaves who were not thinking too kindly towards him because of interactions they had, and others who came back after they were freed, 40 years after Washington's death. They came back to help work on the tomb, the new tomb, and the landscaping around it, and said it was the last thing they could do for the memory of the person who was more than a father to them.
That's actually spot on to one of the questions, and I would elaborate just a bit. Did emancipated slaves stay at Mount Vernon through the tenure of Bushrod Washington, of John Augustine Washington, and other heirs? What do we know about the freed people and whether they stayed and how they lived alongside those still enslaved?
According to the law about freeing your slaves in Virginia, a slave owner was still responsible for the care and upkeep of the enslaved people who were considered either too old or too young and had no parents or whatever to look after them. And so we know that up until the 1830s, there were still, and I have to say that too old to work and take care of themselves was like 45, was considered 45.
No.
That's so. So there were still Washington's executors until the 1830s were still taking care of elderly people who would belong to George Washington and continued living on the plantation. Other people left. They were, they were gone. An article that came out about 2 years ago in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography showed that the freed Washington slaves set up something like 6 free black communities fairly nearby in this part of Fairfax County, and did very well for themselves. And I said, could you share like the names of the people and who was in what community and that sort of thing? And they said, that's our next article. So hopefully we'll find out soon.
Interesting. Martha Moore actually also wants to know something a little. You mentioned archaeology, about whether there's any effort to study the DNA of enslaved people buried at Mount Vernon. What are we studying? What can we know?
So the archaeologists for the last 4 or 5 years have been working on a project down at the slave burial ground to locate each grave down there and identify it in some sort of permanent way. And they've, I believe, found 80 graves so far. They're trying to figure out the entire extent of the burial ground and exactly how many people are buried there. In order to find the graves, they are digging down about a foot, taking off the root mats, and getting down to the top of the grave shaft, where you can see that it's a grave based on changes in the color in the dirt. And they're interested in how the graves are oriented and that kind of thing, which can tell them a lot of information. There is no effort whatsoever to dig into the grave shaft and try to get down to bodies. It just isn't in the plan. What they could find from DNA, and one of the thoughts is that based on the type of soil that's there, there's a good chance that there is nothing to test in there. We don't know for sure, but just knowing what they know about this type of soil, and the fact that it was half a century before people started doing embalming. What you could learn from DNA, if there were any bodies there to be any physical material to be tested, you could find out things. You could tell whether people were buried in family groups at all, whether people were related to one another, if there were physical remains like clothing and things like that. You might be able to date when the person had lived. If there are, it's not DNA, but if on teeth, you can tell where someone grew up. So you could you take a little bit of material, and what you're looking for are isotopes from the water that the person drank when they were growing up. And that tells you where they came from as a child. And so that could tell us, what proportion of people in the burial ground were born in Africa. So there's stuff
to the beginning. We're
not
actually
digging in there. Yeah.
And one of the important things about the archaeological project is a basic respect for the sacred space here. I'm gonna, as we get ready to go out for our reception, and we continue the conversation outside, and people have an opportunity to maybe have you sign their book. I want to let Jim have the last word because he asked us a question that I know is sort of a driving force behind the whole book, which is what does learning about George Washington and slavery, how does that help us understand more about George Washington? And so in that sense, how do we talk about the context of the times, the complexities, the moral challenges of issues like slavery? What are your sort of summation thoughts on this question of Washington and slavery and the moral complexities of understanding and thinking about the past?
I think what it tells us about George Washington is one of the things I love about him is that he changed. He grew up in a system that wasn't questioning slavery at all, and he sure wasn't. And as he lived his life and learned more and thought more, he changed his mind, and he's thinking about what can I do to make it better. He's at the Constitutional Convention where it's very clear that if he or anybody else pushes the issue of freeing slaves, the Constitution isn't going to happen, and the United States that he fought for 8 years to bring into being is gone. And there's a great quote from one of Thomas Jefferson's notebooks when he's Washington's Secretary of State, and he said he'd been talking to, I think it was Edmund Randolph, and Randolph told him that Washington said that if the country broke up over the issue of slavery, he was determined to go to the North. And so he's somebody that really thinks about things, that I think really tries on the issue of slavery. He just, he was fighting a really entrenched system, and there really wasn't a lot he could do but act as in a private capacity.
Well, thank you in this book for helping us not understand his journey, but also the lives of the enslaved people here in Mount Vernon. I wonder if you could help me thank Mary. And let's continue the conversation outside in our reception and have an opportunity to have Mary sign your book. Thank you so much.
Click the subscribe button below and the bell icon to get notifications for new videos about George Washington and behind-the-scenes work at Mount Vernon.